So, good morning and a very warm welcome to the EPC's weekly update. Our look at the key developments in relation to the COVID-19 crisis from a political point of view, economical point of view, and a social point of view, as we look back on the last 7 days and what has been happening both here at EU level and around national capitals. My name is Jackie Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the European Policy Centre. And joining me this week, I'm delighted to have, and you see them on the screen already, Janis Emmanouilidis, the EPC's Director of Studies, and Fabian Zuleeg, who is the EPC's Chief Executive. And joining us a little later on, Annika Hedberg, head of the EPC's Sustainable Prosperity for Europe programme, to talk about the European Green Deal, the fight against climate change and the impact of the COVID-19 crisis in those areas, because in the last 2 weeks, we've received a number of questions about that from all of you, and the EPC has published several articles and commentaries on that. So we will come to that later on. Over 200 of you registered for the event today. We had 300 in the first 2 weeks. It's Easter week, so we're delighted to have so many of you with us again today. Let me just explain how things work for those of us joining for the first time. Your microphones are muted. If later on you want to ask a question, you can do it in one of two ways. You will see next to your name a little hand. You can click on that hand, and a little green hand comes up, and I know you want to take the floor. I then will give as many of you as possible a chance to talk by clicking on your mic. I will unmute you for the time it takes to ask your question and then mute you again to avoid too much interference and noise on the line, as it were. The other way you can do this is in the dashboard on the right of the screen. You can click enter a question and write your question in there, and it will appear on the screen in front of me. 2 requests, please. Could you keep your questions short? I'm trying to quickly glance at them and see what the topic is and when to take those questions. If you write me a small essay, that is clearly much harder to do. So if you could keep them short and to the point. If your question's very detailed and we don't have time to take it during this webinar, we will of course get an analyst to respond to your more detailed questions afterwards. So today we're going to start by focusing on the issue that's in the headlines. Once again, that question of fiscal solidarity. We want to analyse what happened at the 16-hour marathon talks between EU finance ministers on Tuesday overnight into Wednesday, and what may happen today when they reconvene, and what the implications are of all of this. We're going to also look at the work on the EU's exit strategy. Commission proposals shot down this week. What does all that mean? Where are we going? So let us get started. Gentlemen, great to have you with me. And the EU finance ministers meeting. Janis, the marathon talks failed, as I said. The chair of that meeting, Mario Centeno, said they came close. But another EU diplomat commented with commendable understatement. Dutch willingness to search for compromise was rather underdeveloped, and he blamed that for the failure to get a deal. Just how far apart are they still, and what are the biggest sticking points?
Well, first of all, good morning. I think we also, if you followed our debate last week, we were not that much surprised that there was no compromise at this point immediately. We're looking at a very complex compromise, including a lot of different elements. There are a lot of national interests, sensitivities, also sensitivities coming from the past, from previous crises. So it was not that much of a surprise that even though they were together for more than 68 hours, that they were not able to strike a compromise yet. What we're seeing is that there is progress. There's progress, which we've seen happening over the past 2 weeks. There was also progress during the meeting of finance ministers this week. We see that the package is getting together. And there are a good number of elements which are more or less agreed to. So, for example, putting in place support instruments at European level, which has been proposed by the Commission, called SURE, to support Kurzarbeit, as we call it in German, and that's where it originated from, throughout the European Union. There's agreement to do that. There's an agreement to increase the guarantees of the EIB so that it's able to leverage the means as it has, which it has at its disposal to support companies, small and bigger size companies throughout the European Union. There's an agreement that at some point you will also have to revise the MFF proposal. And now come the sticky points. One is the use of the ESM. There is an agreement to use the ESM, to use the credit lines which it provides to support member states. But there's a question, especially with respect to conditionality. So what kind of conditionality would be attached to ESM support? Most member states, almost all, think that the level of conditionality should be extremely low. It should be linked to measures which are aiming to counter the negative effects of the COVID-19 crisis in the given member states, which relates to both the health sector, but also to the negative economic consequences of the COVID-19 crisis. But the Dutch want more. They want higher levels of conditionality. They're talking about different phases. And in the second phase, they're even contemplating that conditionality should lead to reforms of the pension system and to other things which are not immediately related to COVID-19. So it was actually the obstruction, the negative, the no from The Hague, which prohibited getting to an agreement at this point in time.
So it really was one country.
At the end of the day, it actually was one country which was obstructing. Now we know that if one country starts to move, you sometimes have others joining with other points at the final minute. But at the end of the day, it was actually the Dutch which were isolated on that question. And then there's the other sticky point, which is more complex, because here you also have others who are contradicting, which is the idea to put together some kind of a fund, an economic recovery fund. And there are discussions with respect to what's the nature of that potential fund, how would it be constructed, who would be in charge of it, how big does it need to be. Here there are still big differences. So that's another point of
and on corona bonds, I think the Italians were asking for there still to be a reference to them as a possible tool for future use. Some countries not even willing to go along with that reference. Fabian, from your perspective, Janis was saying that we didn't expect them to get a deal last week. I think there was more of an expectation this week that they would, and indeed there was supposed to be an EU leaders teleconference this afternoon to sign off on what they'd agreed. That now won't happen. How serious do you think this continued disagreement is? I mean, Giuseppe Conte said this week, if we don't get an agreement, we might as well erase the European Union. And France's Bruno Le Maire said basically failure is not an option when they reconvene today. Is it an option? How optimistic are you?
Unfortunately, I'm not particularly optimistic at this stage. We are still in a situation where the differences have not been bridged. We are in a situation where certain member states are not on board. I think what is also not helping is that this situation is imposing a strange kind of negotiation on the member states. It's very hard to find the compromises behind closed doors, which can then be put on the table for the European level, which is what normally would happen in this kind of situation. We do need to see more progress. I think progress has been made, but it is not enough at this moment. And I think what we are already starting to see is some of the collateral damage. This is having on cooperation, on the level of integration. I think it is not helpful that political leaders on all sides of this debate are making absolutist statements. Absolutist statements in a situation like this are not going to be sustainable, and they are not helping in terms of reaching an agreement. I think what we need to focus on is to get the instruments in place. I personally don't think it matters what we call them, what exactly the form of them is. I think there will still be changes in future in any case. There will have to be done more in future in any case. So I think we need to get something up and running rather quickly, and not go back to pre-crisis political positions, pre-crisis ideologies, and also pre-crisis blame between different countries. This is too much of a morality issue.
Yeah, I want to come back to this question of how you negotiate in these circumstances. And as you said, that difficulty of not being able to go into the corridor, although I'm wondering whether EU leaders will start using the House Party app, which I haven't tried yet, but I gather enables you to effectively go into the corridors. Question for how they're managing to work. But before we come to an assessment of how the politics of this is being handled and the negotiations, Janis, on the exit strategy, EU leaders asked in their teleconference on March 26th for the Commission to start work on an exit strategy as well as on an economic recovery plan. The idea being that there needed to be a coordinated approach to coming out of the lockdowns in countries. Otherwise, what happens in one could have a negative impact on another. Ursula von der Leyen, Commission President, was supposed to and had said she would come forward with this plan and get it agreed by the Commission this week. But member states who'd asked for it shot it down in flames, seemingly saying they hadn't been consulted properly. How serious is this? Is this a question of politics and the handling of the negotiation, or is there something more serious, i.e. a risk that we can't come up with any form of common approach to this?
Well, first of all, I think it is very important that we come up with what people call an exit strategy. I would call it an exit management strategy, something which is comprehensive, which is coordinated between member states, which is also gradual and phased, because we're not going to exit this crisis in one step, and there might also be some ups and downs as we progress. And you will also have to have a strategy which is adaptable to national, regional, local concerns, because we have seen that there often are different hotspots which have to obviously be treated differently than you do with respect to entire countries. So you need this exit management strategy, and you should definitely avoid what we had in the beginning of the crisis, which was a lack of coordination, which was everyone was doing what they thought was suitable from a national perspective. With respect to the exit strategy, you need to have that in a coordinated way, and you need to have that discussion rather early. It's not about deciding now when to do what, but it's about having a discussion about what should be done. And that discussion has started at national level. In some countries, you even go further because there are already more concrete ideas, like, for example, in Austria, on what to do when. In other countries, you have a starting discussion debate about what a national exit strategy might look like. But we actually haven't had a real, and we do not have a real European debate about an exit strategy. And here, time comes in. So the fact that the Commission, which had announced that it would come forward with a first proposal with ideas of what this European exit strategy might look like, what the guiding principles and key elements would be, I think that would have been good in order to foster a transnational European debate about it, and to overcome the fact that we're only having national debates. But there were some member states who think that this was too early. This was the main reason why they obstructed. And they also felt that they were not consulted enough. If the latter is the case, that obviously is a deficit, because you know how sensible an exit strategy and debate about it is, which means that you need to have close debates with member states governments. Now you have the problem that in some member states you don't even have a national debate yet, so that makes it more difficult. But I think it was not good news that the first draft or the proposal didn't come out this week.
Okay, so Fabian, not good news, but to what extent do you see this as a mishandling? I mean, what is your assessment so far of the way the Commission and Ursula von der Leyen in particular is handling these negotiations? Because we all know if the Commission comes forward with something that doesn't already have significant member state backing, doesn't stand a chance. So did she miscalculate, or are member states being somewhat deliberately obtuse in this area because they're not ready to do this? And we haven't talked at all, almost in any of these webinars so far, about the role of Charles Michel, the European Council President, who seems to have been very quiet when one wonders whether he might be helping in this area on the exit strategy, or indeed on the finance ministers' talks in some virtual shuttle diplomacy to help find those compromises. What's your reading of the politics of this?
I think there can always be a debate when it comes to a situation like the one we are finding ourselves in at the moment, about whether it is the institutions which are not doing enough, whether it is the member states which are being too obstructive. I think in a number of ways, I would say both. It is not either or. We do need more leadership from the institutions. What we also need from the institutions, I think, is the shuttle diplomacy. It is bringing together positions, being the honest broker, which can help to find compromises, which can be carried by all of the member states. But the member states have to be willing to do that. They have to show that they are also willing to compromise on some of these issues, which has been in short supply. But I think we should also look back to the Euro crisis and see what the processes were at that point. And there it was extremely important to have close cooperation between the President of the Council and the President of the Commission, working hand in hand to forge this compromise between the member states. And I think we need to see something similar. It needs both of those working together to be able to also convince, and at times maybe even go as a go-between between some of those countries, so that we can get to a compromise position, which can then also be presented much more positively. At the moment, the outcome of any kind of negotiation is seen as a victory for one side or the other, and that doesn't help to get to a resolution.
And indeed, I know that you and Janis are working on a commentary on the very question of the lessons we can learn from the Euro crisis and how they might be applied now. So we look forward to reading more on that. Janis, I'm just wondering here, the EU has done a lot. We talked last week about it was a faltering start. There were some very negative signals in terms of, for example, medical equipment, export bans and so on, but the EU has got its act together. The Commission has done a lot in terms of releasing other funds, regional funding and so on. The EIB, the European Investment Bank, doing a huge amount, the European Central Bank doing a lot. Yet the coverage is all about the failure of finance ministers to reach a deal. Is that because of the way member states are talking about these meetings when they come out from them? Is that because maybe they shot too high? What's your reading of the damage this is doing to the EU's image, and whether there's anything they could have done and can do now to mitigate that?
Well, it has obviously done damage. Especially the beginning in terms of the inability of the European Union and its member states to coordinate some of the reactions with respect to the crisis. You mentioned some examples, and now you need to counter some of the mistakes which have been committed in the past. So yes, it has had a negative effect in some member states, a very strong negative effect if you look into the Italian debate, and you can see that Salvini and the likes in the countries are exploiting that. And using arguments which sometimes are objectively not correct, but still using them and also finding some support in the wider population. So you need to counter these things. This is why it is so important now to get a rather quick agreement with respect to the fiscal package. I'm not sure that there will be an agreement today. Maybe it has to again go, or it has to go to the level of heads of state and government. Some EU leaders might want that, others might not want it. But you need to come to a quick conclusion of that package, even if, and I agree fully with what Fabian said earlier, this package is not the final word. There will be other things which will have to come after there's an agreement on the package today. But you need to come up with a solution in order to also convey the message that we are able to find a consensus. The same goes for the exit management strategy. But having said that, I think if you look back over the past weeks, and these days, weeks are sometimes progressing much slower than they did in the past. So we think we are in a lockdown for months, whereas it's only for weeks. So if you take into account that what has happened over the past week, there have been some things happening which are also extraordinary. What the ECB did and decided on the 18th of March was quick. without a strong political backing. Putting all the things together which are now being put together with respect to the fiscal package. If you look into what we did in past phases of the poly crisis, and this is part of the poly crisis, it took us often much longer. So I think, yes, one needs to be critical. One also needs to say that more needs to be done, and more needs to be done faster. But at the same time, there are also things which are happening, and which one should also highlight these things.
Okay, Fabian, just one more quick one, and then I'm going to go out to the room. We're getting quite a lot of written questions, and a couple of hands have already gone up. Janis just said then he's not sure they will get a deal today. It might have to be done by EU leaders. Would you agree with that? And if so, what signal do you think that would send? Is there a way of managing expectations this time around so it doesn't cause quite as much damage in terms of people's image of the EU squabbling and arguing and unable to agree with itself?
Yeah, I think it is very likely to have to go to EU leaders in the end. These are big political decisions. They are decisions which governments will have to justify in their domestic environment. So it is unlikely that any finance minister would be able to take those decisions on behalf of a government. But I think what we need to see is a better choreography, a better way of leading from one to the other. What we should see today, ideally, is an agreement between the finance ministers about a broad landing zone. That's not to say that they will get all the details in place. It's not to say that they will get the sign-off politically today. But if you have that broad landing zone, then there's also a point in convening the leaders together. The problem we've had in the past on a number of different policy files is when you bring the leaders together without having that landing zone in place, they cannot agree. And then the image we are giving is more squabbling, more differences, more intransigence. There will be blame, there will be the moral arguments which are putting in place, and that is the last thing we need at the moment.
Okay.
So we need that agreement for landing zone.
Sorry,
There's one thing I would like to add.
Sure.
I think what we're seeing, and that is something which is positive, is that cooperation between Germany and France is working better. We have been discussing for a while now, at least over the past 1 to 2 years, how the relationship between Paris and Berlin had deteriorated, that there were substantial differences, there were structural problems between them. But now in the context of the pressure coming from the COVID-19 crisis, with respect to the health pressures, the economic pressures, the potential political consequences, we see that Germany and France are coordinating among themselves, are pushing for joint positions, are issuing joint statements like the one of Olaf Scholz and Bruno Le Maire. So we see that Paris and Berlin are trying to get their act together. They often disagree with respect to the level of ambition, but at least they cooperate and they know that they need each other, because if they two don't cooperate, you don't get a solution at European level.
But it is quite striking. We talked earlier about the Netherlands, that even when they are cooperating, that used to be enough at EU level. Once the French and Germans came into line with each other, then a deal followed. We're seeing with the problem with the Netherlands that that doesn't apply in today's EU. So again, long-term lessons to draw from that. Let us go out to the room. I'm going to start with someone who has their hand up in the virtual world, and then we'll come to some of the written questions. Ana Gomez, you have the floor.
Hello. My question is, do you think that indeed the Dutch are alone in blocking this tool, short-term tool, which would be the ESM, or are actually they doing their master's voice, so Germany? And then what about the long-term recovery fund? How to fund it? As the question of taxation being considered, carbon taxation, digital taxation, the CCCTB, or even as Zuckman has suggested, the tax over the 1% fortunes, mirroring the one that was used by Germany after the Second World War. Is this part of the discussion? Should be.
Thank you very much indeed, Anna. And there is also a question coming a written question: to what extent can only one country, in this case, namely the Netherlands, prevent a consensus on an agreement on a common approach? So 2 questions really there. Is the Netherlands acting as the front man for more significant opposition? And is there anything that can be done if only the Netherlands holds out? Who would like to come in on that? Fabian, please.
I mean, I think what we are seeing is what we have maybe seen in the past with the role of the UK, that it is convenient for a number of countries not to be in the position to have to be the one who says no if someone else is doing that. I wouldn't say that the Netherlands are acting as a puppet for Germany, but I think the question is whether Germany is putting enough pressure on the Netherlands behind the scenes. And that's where I'm not sure. I think it is not likely that Germany is pushing the Netherlands very hard at the moment. And in the end, this is what needs to happen. There needs to be a very strong push from Germany, because when we're looking at the economic situation, when we're looking at the political situation, the Netherlands would find it very difficult to go into complete opposition to the German position. So I think there is something there, but we also need to be careful that we are not excluding a country, that we are not taking a country outside of the discussions we have. There has been some suggestion that we should just go ahead without the Netherlands, and that there could be a solution which doesn't involve all the member states. I think that would be a very dangerous signal. And it would lead to a situation where other countries might well consider where they would stand in that kind of environment. So I think we need to involve the Netherlands, but more pressure from Germany to find a solution would be good.
Thank you very much. And one question about the exit strategy, Janis. Joe Leinen asking, the exit strategy is looking also at this question of closed borders within the EU. I know there was an article by Mary de Sommer, EPC senior analyst, this week on the question of the impact on Schengen. To what extent is this exit strategy looking at that question as well? Do you know?
Obviously, it needs to also have that in mind, and it will have that in mind, because the fact that we have closed borders de facto, de jure, is a problem in such interlinked economies, interlinked societies in Europe. Closing borders is not only problematic, but it's also questionable, because actually we have the virus in each and every member state. So there can be, and there should be, a strong discussion as to whether having border controls, closing borders, actually helps in dealing with the crisis and dealing with the virus in future. I think that there are other elements we need to concentrate equally strongly on. We now see that there are 3 elements which seem to be key with respect to the future phases, which is testing, the use of masks, and the use of a pan-European app to trace people who have been positive in a data-confirmed way. So protection of borders is an element. Just one short reflection on the Dutch question, and the idea that with respect to the Dutch, actually they're more behind them. I think with respect to the ESM question, the question of conditionality, you have a strong voices in Germany saying this is not about reforming the sector X, Y, or Z. This is about actually providing assistance to a country which needs assistance via the ESM to fight the immediate effects of COVID-19. That's it. And we've seen the German finance minister saying that very clearly. Even Angela Merkel was indicating something in that direction. So on that issue, I think it is clear. With respect to putting up some kind of Corona fund in whatever shape, there are also differences which go beyond the Netherlands, and there are countries also, including Germany, or the governments of these countries. I think we always need to be careful what we talk about, who are supportive of the Dutch case.
Jackie, can I just come in, because we didn't answer the question on how you would fund a recovery fund. And I think for me, the key thing here is, yes, we need to be ambitious, but we should also be careful that we are not making things too complicated. If we are trying to invent new instruments now, if we're trying to put new mechanisms into place, this will take time, and that will also mean that you will then have to go into political discussions. You will have to find political consensus for any new instrument.
Okay.
So I think the first step has to be that we get something in place quickly, that is financed in a way which is doable quickly. Then we can always have a discussion about how we might supplement that, how we might have new instruments which come on top of that.
Okay.
Because I think whatever we're doing will not be enough in any case. So we will need to go further in future, but for the moment, speed is of the essence.
Yeah, and I know also you are working on a commentary on the economic impact of the crisis on that recovery plan. So we look forward to reading more about that. One last question before I move to climate change and the Green Deal. There's two questions, but I'm going to link them together, and brief answers if you would, gentlemen, please, because we don't have all that long. From Philippe de Boek, the European citizens don't understand the role of the Commission in these difficult times. Is there not a need to review in depth the communication strategy to show what the Commission is doing positively? That goes back to my question earlier about they are doing things, people don't seem to know. And linked to that, there was an argument this week, a very public argument between Mauro Ferrari, who was president of the European Research Council, a new appointment, who said he was leaving his post because he was disgusted the EU was doing too little. They hit back, the ERC, saying, no, you've left your post because we asked you to resign because for various reasons. How much damage did that do? So a quick thought on the communications aspect, if you would. Who would like to come in first here?
I can start on this one. Obviously, there is a lack of communication. There's also a lack of appreciation with respect to what's being done at European level, also with respect to the Commission, which, by the way, and this is an old discussion, is also the responsibility of member states and member states governments to highlight what is being done at European level and what the Commission has been doing over the past weeks. At the same time, we, I think, are at the beginning of this crisis, of a very severe crisis. It will last for a while. And I think in this phase, it is not about changing or adapting or having a different communication strategy. It might sound very simple, but it is simple. It is delivery. So if there is now an agreement in the Eurogroup on the fiscal package, that is a strong sign. And if that package includes elements which the Commission plays a strong and key role in it, that is how you communicate. So I think we should not commit the mistake of concentrating on communication, because that is conveying the message that maybe we are trying to cover something up, or maybe we are trying to showcase what we're doing every day, whereas we should concentrate on delivery, and that is a responsibility, obviously, of the Commission, but especially also of member states' governments.
Okay. Let us come on now, if we might, to the question of climate change and the European Green Deal. As I say, a number of questions from all of you in our previous webinars. There's a question already today with somebody asking, linking this to the exit strategy, and is there any discussion about how green the exit strategy should be? And so I'm delighted to welcome to join us for this part of our discussion, Annika Hedberg, who, as I said earlier, is head of the EPC's Sustainable Prosperity for Europe programme. The EPC has published a commentary by policy analyst Sofia Lopez Piqueres on this, and Annika published both in Euractiv and on the EPC website this week an article entitled "The Corona Crisis, a Catalyst for Climate Action." So a very warm welcome, Annika. In terms of the impact on the broad climate change debate, we've heard two arguments. We've heard an argument that says this is a moment that makes a real difference for two reasons. One, because we've seen by changing our normal activities just what a great impact it has, and so what can be done and what difference it can make. and that people are discovering new ways of doing things, and others saying, no, we're losing momentum horribly. The postponement of COP26 has taken that momentum away, that pressure to act. You argued in your Euractiv article, you said the crisis shows where there's a will, there's a way. Do you therefore believe, are you optimistic that the climate change debate doesn't get put on the back burner, as it were, because of what we're going through now?
First of all, very warm good morning also from my side. I do recognize that while we are very much in the process of reacting to the health crisis at the moment, actually for the climate crisis, and there could be opportunities, possibilities hidden in this crisis, but we would need to utilize and build on these opportunities. Maybe just obviously we can differentiate between what's happening within the EU and what's happening on a global level, but if I just start with what's happening at EU level now, we already have seen that the EU member states, in theory at least, have recognized and are committed to sustainable growth. In the member states' joint statement on 26th of March, they themselves clearly committed to sustainable growth when planning for coordinated exit strategy, recovery plan, and investment in the future. Also, when we're looking at the messages coming out from the European Commission, it's very clear Green Deal should be our growth strategy when we exit and recover from the corona crisis. And on top of this, when the Commission put out the public consultation on raising EU's climate target for 2030, this clearly sends a very welcome signal that the work continues and that the climate challenge is an issue that we need to address.
But you say in theory at least, as you say, it's there on paper. I'm looking at that statement that EU leaders put out after their teleconference, where they did indeed underline the green transition and the digital transformation. But the politics of this, Annika, aren't governments going to be entirely focused now on dealing with this unprecedented economic impact, some saying worse than the Great Depression, the worst economic crisis we've ever seen? So whatever they're saying in theory, and the Commission, I think, is still insisting that the Green Deal, for example, will be at the heart of its recovery, its growth strategy for the future. But politically, is it really feasible to get agreement when we come to talk about any of the specific measures as opposed to a broad commitment in this area? And if it isn't, how serious would that be?
I agree that the challenge is enormous. As we're taking the immediate reactions, also in the medium term, now where will the state aid be spent? How will the new credits be spent? Are we going to be supporting greater circularity, energy efficiency, renewable, sustainable mobility and agriculture with this money that is being made available is a big question. Also, while we can expect, or should expect at least, that while the Commission is working on exit, but especially on the recovery strategy, that there will be very strong commitments made to the Green Deal goals. The question is, how will the member states react? Another issue is that what is the general buy-in to the Green Deal as the EU's growth strategy? We've already heard that, for example, Flanders region in Belgium plans to block Green Deal as it doesn't address the economic crisis. So we see that there are serious hurdles to be addressed. At the same time, on a positive, the work has been started. We have had EU member states coming together and agreeing in principle to the climate neutrality goal and recognizing that there are enormous economic as well as social and environmental benefits that can come if we can get ourselves on a more sustainable track. And so this, in principle, the work that has started should now pave the way as we try to exit this crisis and recover from this crisis.
But a question mark, because we've already seen the Czech Prime Minister has already suggested the Green Deal should be put on hold. Some MEPs last week called for it. So question mark as to, as we move forward, as I say, how real that commitment will be. But can I ask you, and based on the arguments that you put in your article and also in the commentary by Sophia, what does the EU concretely need to do? What for you are the key recommendations? You've talked not just about the climate strategy more broadly, but you also talk about the farm to fork strategy for the agricultural sector, the zero pollution strategy. Where for you are the key priorities for action? And then I'll give Fabian and Janis a chance to react and then go out to the room again. Annika, what do they need to do?
So first of all, I think the realization needs to be there that greater sustainability is an answer to the ongoing crisis, to the ongoing health crisis and the expected economic crisis. We should be both in the exit as well as the recovery strategies. We should be benefiting from and contributing to greening European economy. I think it's extremely important to keep in mind that when we look at pandemics like COVID-19, these are very much driven by what happens in our environment, what happens with climate change, what happens with biodiversity, with deforestation. What happens in our environment matters for our health, and we have a very strong interest to address these kind of risk factors if we want to have, if we want to try to actually address the societal economic impacts that come from crises like COVID-19. And thus, it's essential that when we look at the MFF, the EU budget, Common Agriculture Policy, Commission's work on farm-to-fork strategies, zero pollution strategies, work on biodiversity, it is essential that these lessons are taken to the heart and that we actually build these in as we work forward. Now in the short term, obviously, our leaders must help people and businesses to address the immediate impacts of the corona crisis. But we also need to see that the leaders are clear about the direction of travel, and they need to start to create those conditions for people, business, to come out stronger from this crisis. Our people, businesses need skills, they need solutions to face the ultimately an even bigger crisis that is looming, which is the climate and the wider sustainability crisis. And in that regard, we do need to continue to reduce our emissions and change how we produce and consume. And if I may just say, the basis is there, and now we need to work on those tools that we have in place to make sure that the investments go in the right direction, and that we use the skills and the capabilities that we already have.
Okay, Fabian, Janis, a quick reaction on that. And I don't know, Fabian, whether you could say 2 words also about the global dimension of all of this.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing at the moment is immediate existential crisis is hitting the long-term existential crisis. And we need to find a way of bringing both of those under one hat, because we cannot afford to ignore the long-term existential crisis to deal with the current crisis. And I think that is important to reiterate. It is an existential crisis. This is about human existence. It is about as serious as it can get. So we will need to see action rather sooner. But one of the difficulties here is that, and we have always known that, that we need to see that action at the global level, not just at the European level. It is not enough if Europe alone acts. We need to convince others that this is the right path. I think we are seeing even more worrying signs around the globe that the commitment to addressing the climate crisis is weakening in the immediate future, and that I think for many people there's this idea that somehow we will just go back to normal as soon as the restrictions are loosened, and then if we then return to the kind of growth rates we've seen in air travel, in consumption patterns, in a number of different areas which are having a negative impact on the climate, yes, we will gain a little bit of time because the reduced economic activity at the moment is also reducing emissions. It's reducing the negative impact we're having on the climate for now. But that is not a long-term sustainable solution. And I think that's where we have to be able to get to.
Thank you. And Janis, in terms of the politics of all of this, again, as Annika said, everything is there still on paper, at least the commitment to drive forward the green agenda is there. But is it, for example, going back to a question from the audience, is it in the exit strategy? Is it going to be part of it? Is it also, when we look at sustainability, another question about the economic, the social, the ecological aspects, sustainability having those 3 pillars? Is it there in the Green Deal? And do you believe that EU leaders will, if you like, put their money where their mouth is in terms of the green recovery plan and maintaining the deal? Or frankly, is it politically just not going to happen?
Well, I think that everyone is now concentrating on the immediate concerns, and that's normal. That's both at national level, at regional level, at European level. The question is as to whether some of the things which are actually related to the Green Deal, to climate change, will be in the interest of doing because it is in the strong interest, not because of a form of altruism towards future generations, but because it actually makes sense. And I think that what this crisis is showing, that there are certain things where it makes sense to change our behavior. The fact that we're meeting this way, and this is happening all over the world, means that in terms of travel, why do we need to travel for certain things like doing these kind of events? This is something concrete. And I think there are a lot of other things which are very concrete, but the politics of it is now putting pressure on having these discussions with respect to the Green Deal, and Annika was highlighting this, but it shouldn't stop doing the right things. Just one word with respect to the exit strategy and the growth strategy, and is the growth strategy part of the exit strategy? I think we need to be careful not to overburden the so-called exit strategy. The exit strategy mostly should be about how can we loosen some of the measures which we have taken at national level, at European level, to get the economy started, while at the same time having the health crisis in our minds. I think in the beginning of the crisis, we made the mistake to consider that these are 2 different things. They are strongly interlinked. The health crisis and economic recovery. There are 2 sides of the same coin. We have to think both of these things together. And I think that the exit strategy needs to concentrate mostly on how can we go back, not to the status quo ante, but loosen some of the measures we've been taking in order to have a strong economic activity, because at the end of the day, we know that 2020 is going to be a very deep economic recession. The question is what happens in 2021.
Okay, thank you. We have someone just pointing out, Mate Dubois is pointing out online, yes, we're traveling, less, but we also need to take account of our digital ecological footprint. Online interaction is also weighing on the climate, so it's not as simple as it may appear. But thank you for that very much, Mate. I want to go out to the floor again. Malcolm Harbour, just trying to unmute your mic.
Yes, I'm unmuted.
Hello there.
Yeah, well, good morning, everybody, and to Annika in particular. I want to make the point about what I regard as a really valuable incentive that's going to rise out of COVID, is that governments have finally decided that they are not restricted by procurement regulation in their ability to invest in new innovations. If you look at the Commission's paper about public procurement at times of COVID, you'll see for the first time that concepts like hackathons and technology contests are included as being perfectly legitimate under the public procurement regulation. And actually finally unleashing and getting out of the perceived straitjacket. And it is a straitjacket because, having been involved deeply in the reform of the 2014 rules, I can tell you we made them as innovation friendly as possible. I think we have a real opportunity here to say, if we're having a climate emergency, we should be treating public engagement and investment in innovation in the same way as we have with the COVID emergency, and get on with it. Yeah. And irrespective of whether the Green Deal exists in its present form or not, it's quite clear that innovation and science are going to solve the problem. So let's focus on that to begin with, and simply encourage that behavior to continue in the climate action goals. And as a senior advisor on the single market for EPC, my colleagues and I are busy working on this idea at this very moment.
Very good. Watch this space, ladies and gentlemen. Annika, I have a specific question. How or why is climate change impacting on virus pandemic? So the link between climate change itself and the pandemic. Do we know? Do you know anything about that? It's much more a question for an I can never say this word. Epidemiologist. No, I always get it wrong. Never mind. Can you answer that at all?
So just to say something that I myself have found quite interesting, but this is actually less related to climate change, but it's the fact that researchers are currently looking into whether fine particle pollution in air could actually carry the coronavirus. And obviously, this kind of research is extremely important because if it was proven right, this obviously would have significant implications on efforts to try to reduce air pollution in a much faster way than is currently being done. And that would also have implications then to address our climate crisis. When it comes to the drivers for pandemics like COVID-19 and how climate change, biodiversity loss and deforestation impacts that. And that would require a whole nother discussion, I would say, and something that we are happy to engage also in debating at EPC.
Absolutely, we'll come back on that maybe another time. One more question from the floor, Sylvia Kotanidis. Sylvia, are you there?
Hi, do you hear me?
Yes, we hear you beautifully.
Yeah, very good. I had a question for Janis and Fabian, if possible, if they are aware of or what they think personally about the possibility to implement some of the financial measures through enhanced cooperation, whether it has been discussed in the closed circles, political circles. And I refer also not only to the Corona bonds, but also other types of mess without conditionality, for example, just to make sure that the countries that agree on a specific strategy, only them participate. Just a question on that. I know that there is, I saw floating an article of Varoufakis in the past who had perhaps envisaged that type of mechanism where only 9 states would be enough. In this case, it seems that there are many more than 9 states. So I just want to hear your opinion on that.
Okay, who would like to come in first? Fabian?
Yeah, certainly there's a discussion around whether you can go ahead with a smaller number of member states, whether that is in the form of enhanced cooperation, which is the formal mechanism. It could also be in the form of agreements between member states which are outside the European system. I think these are possibilities, but I think for the moment at least, I think we need to be very clear that this is second best and that this is not the kind of solution which we should be envisaging. Also because of the long-term impact that has. If countries can effectively stop being part of these common solutions, is that really the right message in terms of going forward? And I think we also have to recognize that in the end, this is about effectiveness. It's about being able to concentrate as much firepower together. And if we are starting to see a fragmentation of that, it's not going to help. We also need to be very careful in the financial field that if we have common instruments, that these don't end up compounding weaknesses rather than addressing them. If you put together a number of countries which are struggling in terms of fiscal sustainability, then that doesn't necessarily give you the benefit which you are actually wanting from an instrument like Corona bonds. So I think it is something to think about, and maybe we will come to the point where it is the only possibility. But for this point in time, politically, they are very much second best. Economically, they are second best, and we should continue having the pressure that all the member states should be participating.
Thank you.
May I just add to that?
Janis.
Yes, I'll be briefly. There is no concrete discussion with respect to using the legal instrument of enhanced cooperation. However, there are discussions happening as to whether, and there are proposals out there arguing that those who are willing should progress. For example, with respect to the growth fund, to have a group of member states who are willing to do so, to have a common issuance of debt involving them. I think one can discuss a lot of things, but I think in terms of the strategy, it needs to be a coherent strategy involving everyone. If you then in the implementation decide that some are more willing than others, so be it. But with respect to the strategy, everyone should be on board, because otherwise you have a level of fragmentation with negative spillover effects beyond the concrete issue. So I think be worried. But we've seen always when it comes to different speeds involving not all member states, that this is also being used as a pressure instrument. So when some say we might consider to do something, even if not everyone is involved, this might push the others to move more. And I think that in this respect, this is another case where that might have an effect, which could be positive, but we need to have everyone on board with respect to the overall strategy.
Thank you. We are almost out of time, but I just want to try and get some assessment of where we are at this stage in the crisis, because the German Chancellor Angela Merkel warned on Monday. She said the EU was facing its greatest test since its foundation, and the answer could only be, and I quote, more Europe, a stronger Europe, and a well-functioning Europe. Based on what we've seen so far, how likely is it that we will get to that in the end, even if it's a little painful on the way? Annika, are you an optimist or a pessimist about where all this goes? Then Janis, then Fabian, then we'll close. Literally 30 seconds, 40 seconds each, if you would. Annika first. Can you hear me, Annika? I think she can't hear me. You may be muted. Never mind. Janis, optimistic, pessimistic, where are we? Are we going to get a stronger and more well-functioning Europe at the end of all this?
Agnostic. Agnostic, because we actually do not know what the effects of this crisis will be. If you think of a potential negative scenario in the health sector, in the economic sector, in the financial sector, in the political, the geopolitical sector, this could turn really into a nightmare scenario. I'm not saying that it will happen, but I'm saying it could happen. So we are agnostic in terms of how big of an effect this crisis will have. Having said that, I think compared to where we were, for example, at the beginning of the so-called euro area crisis in 2010, where nobody was actually aware of potentially where this could lead to. Yeah. They were not aware of the potential spiraling out of control of the crisis. Today is different. And I think that is something which is good. It's positive. There is an awareness that if this situation, this crisis spirals out of control, actually the price everyone will have to pay in Europe, beyond Europe, the European Union member states, everyone will have to pay, will be or could be enormous. And I think this is something which is pressuring member states to come up with compromises. And if that's the fact, in retrospect, we might say, we saw things happening which we wouldn't think possible, and actually that has moved us further. But again, I'm an agnostic.
Okay, and we look forward to your commentary that you and Fabian are writing on the lessons of the Euro crisis and that interesting analysis of we're in a different point as we start out here than we were then. Annika, can you now hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I hope you can hear me.
Are you overall optimistic that we will come out in your area with a stronger Europe, a Europe focused on delivering on the sustainability agenda or not? What's your assessment based on what we've seen so far? Briefly, if you would.
The optimist in me wants to say that the crisis has dramatically demonstrated the importance of cooperation and actually trying to manage crisis collectively. So I am an optimist, and I want to be an optimist that we will be seeing enhanced coordination between member states, but also on a global level. And it's something just building up on what was discussed on the global context. It's more important than ever that the EU now takes and shows leadership also in a global context and demonstrates that we can address global crisis together.
Thank you. Fabian, you have the last word.
So as an economist, I'm optimistic and pessimistic at the same time. I'm optimistic because I believe that necessity will drive cooperation. We will have to do things together. We are far too interdependent not to. So at the end of this, action will be taken. It will not be taken immediately. It will be taken against resistance, but it will come. And over time, it will increase as well, because this crisis is going to have very deep impact. Where I'm pessimistic is that if we are persisting in getting to that point, in the way we have gotten to that point up to now, with all the acrimony, with the blaming of each other, with the lack of a common purpose, a common vision, then the collateral damage of that process is going to be very significant. And that is what really worries me, is that, yes, we might do the right thing in the end, but by getting there through this long and torturous way, which we are seeing every day at the moment, that we are destroying a lot on the way. So that makes me more pessimistic, but this is not over yet. We are at the beginning of a process, and there is still time for leaders, for the decision makers to come together, to actually address this together, and to show that in the end, the European Union is by far the best instrument anywhere in the world to address a cross-border crisis like the one we are facing.
Thank you. And on that uplifting note, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank Fabian, Janis and Annika very much indeed for their contributions to today's debate. And I'd like to thank all of you for attending in such numbers in Easter week. Fabian was there talking about how to avoid that collateral damage, how to avoid a bitter blame game afterwards. We will have with us next week a very special EPC weekly update, because we're going to be joined by the EPC's president, Herman Van Rompuy, of course, the former European Council president and former Prime Minister of Belgium. He's writing a commentary for the EPC that will be published in the coming days on the crisis, on the lessons we can draw, and we can discuss all of these things with him exceptionally to fit in with his schedule. Next week's weekly update, it reverts to its normal Friday slot, but at 2 p.m. instead of in the morning. So 2 p.m. next Friday with Herman Van Rompuy, for those of you who can join us. And in the meantime, I just want to wish you a very good Easter, and please stay safe, and hopefully we will see you again next week. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.